Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why we need to learn to squat as wide as possible. Now, when I make a statement like this, there's going to always be exceptions to the rule. Always going to be exceptions to the rule. Why? Because there are exceptions to every rule, and if you don't mention these exceptions, people freak out on you and they try to use the most extreme examples they can possibly think of to disprove your rule that applies to 99.999987% of the population. They found a guy somewhere, therefore you're wrong. Okay? There's some dude in Zimbabwe who's the exception to your rule. So you're wrong. And those people are idiots, so we have to derail those idiots up front. People who have sport-specific needs that need a narrower stance would probably benefit from some narrower stance squatting. There we go. It's all encompassing. You play in a sport that has a benefit or a need for the narrower stance. You should still do most of your squatting wide though. Now, why? And what do we mean by as wide as possible? Most people, if they have been squatting fairly narrow, and we'll call shoulder width narrow, that is narrow. And I've seen guys who see me doing some narrow stance squatting in the past, like, wow, your squat stance is wide. And I'm just like, oh my God, that's scary, because that was like the baseline minimum narrow most of you should even be starting with. So I got to wonder, like, are you guys doing like inside of nipple width? Like, are your feet an inch apart? What are you guys doing? I don't get it. But over to the point. Wide stance. Why? Use the most muscles possible. Use the most muscles possible. It's more athletic. It's better for sports. And we get better left or right balance. And that's one of those things too. I'll get guys who will say stuff like, well, I've developed a unilateral imbalance. Like, well, how much of your lower body stuff are you doing narrow? I promise you that's a factor. You get a lot of the benefits of isolateral by going wide. Okay? And going wide makes you just as strong as going narrow. Makes you just as strong as going narrow. In other words, if you add 100 pounds to your wide stance squat, I promise you your shoulder width squat will probably go up 100 pounds also. Or 80 pounds. Even if you haven't been doing it. Wide transfers to narrow. Narrow doesn't transfer to wide. Why is that? Because we get less hip involvement. You have weaker, less developed hips if you squat with a narrow stance. You have a less hip development. So if you don't develop your hips with a bunch of other exercises in your groin, so I mean the abductors and the adductors, how do you remember that? Well, the abductors are up near the abs, up at the top on the outside, right? Just outside the abs, down below them. That's how I remember it. Whereas in the adductors are inside the thigh, the groin muscle. And no, that's not how people get carrot-shaped quads, by the way. You get carrot-shaped quads by doing too many leg extensions and not enough deep squatting. For those who also don't know that. Dealing with different parts of the quad. So, if your hips are weak, when you try to go to the wide stance that needs more hip, you're going to be weak. You're also going to have range of motion issues and mobility issues. Why? What causes mobility issues? Muscle imbalances. That's why mobility work doesn't work. Remember I told you guys before for my shoulders I've been doing tons of mobility work for over a year and saw no benefit. But then I just started developing the weaker muscles, putting a bunch of work and hypertrophy work into some of the weaker, smaller muscles, and all of a sudden I had shoulder mobility. Yeah. Muscle imbalances. So if you can't get any depth and it hurts and it's painful and everything else and you go wide, we have a muscle imbalance issue. You lack the mobility because you don't have the muscle mass in the right spots. You have to build those muscles up. Of course, people will also say, but what if I want to squat just to get big quads? What? We squat to get jacked and strong. It'll build your quads, but let's come over to that point. How many of you guys say, I won't do a chin-up because I only want my biceps to grow, not my lats? See how dumb that is? Quads are not particularly hard to build. If you're doing a good, solid, well-rounded strength and conditioning program, your quads are going to be massive. What are you talking about? Your quads are going to be so big that you're going to think they're too big if you actually get on a really good strength program. So that should be the least of your concerns. It's not a real issue. It's not something you should actually be concerned with. Besides, the wide stance squat works the quads just as much. Studies have looked at it, they found that. They have found that. But what they don't do is give us the same amount of hip development and strength. Also, we can move more weight. We're stronger with the wide stance. Now, some people say, well, how does that affect recovery? Well, of course it does, because we're moving more weight. But we would never do any heavy lift if that was a concern. You could always squat on the box. Box squat's easier to recover from with the same RPE. So there's your solution. All right, instead of saying, well, I'm worried about recovery, so I'm just going to squat narrow stance, so I'm forced to be a weaker pussy and lift a lighter weight. Or, you could box squat and still work all the same muscles and get even better explosiveness. You could do that too. That would be a better alternative. That's all I do. It's all my lifters do. We don't do back squats usually unless we're testing our max on it. Of course, people will say, it can't carry over. It completely carries over. If you hit a 500-pound box squat correctly, and you can do it properly, your back squat's going to be 500 plus. It will probably be more than 500. The first time you do it. And I mean literally the first time you do it in your entire life. Ever, if you've never even done a back squat. Yes, it works like that. So, wide stance. Hey, it's going to give you more strength, more muscle development. It'll give you more strength and more muscle development. On top of that, it's going to make you better at sports. You're going to be more athletic. You're going to be less injury prone also. You know what I mean by more athletic? Oftentimes on a playing field, do you see someone have to use a staggered footing? Okay? Or have to pivot off one leg. You'll see a lot of coaches who are like, oh, we need to do isolateral work to help with that. No, the wide stance squatting will do the same thing. I'm not saying you couldn't benefit from isolateral leg work. Okay? And I want to make that clear also. That has its place. But if that's actually a concern of yours and you're standing here saying, well, I'm going to need those attributes, why don't you just squat in a way that will give you carryover to those attributes? The ability to use your hips, the ability to pivot off of one foot, the ability to use one leg if you have to, because again, we get better use of using each leg. All right? Let's look at what's involved. We also get more even development because you can't shift to the side as easily to push through. You have to push evenly with both legs when it gets difficult. It's easier to cheat and use compensatory strength with a narrow stance squat. The wide stance squat forces you to use more muscles and to use both legs with more even force distribution. All right, that's going to give you better single leg strength also when you get out on a playing field, because you don't always get to pick which leg. A lot of the benefits that you're getting from the isolateral work you're already getting this way. So why don't you just squat that way then if you're going to play sports? Why don't you just learn to squat that way and then you won't have to do as much isolateral work. Make things easier on yourself, guys. Easier as in not saying we don't want to train hard, but we need to train intelligent. And let's come back over to that muscle balance thing. Guys who are like, I have one side bigger or weaker than the other. Yep, and that's going to make you more injury prone, isn't it? Okay, the wide stance squat is going to protect you from injury better in the long term. It'll protect you from injury better in the long term. Are you going to be able to squat as wide as possible at the start? Absolutely not. You're going to have to build it up. You're going to have to build it. But I would recommend that you do so. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.